What could be more perfect for writing your debut novel than near total isolation in a remote part of the world, with only patchy internet access, with nobody but yourself, your characters, and the local wildlife for company, and a whole 3 months stretching out in front of you? Before you answer, may we recommend you read Bleaker House, because its author, Nell Stevens, found herself in just that situation. And her experience is likely to surprise you, charm you, and make you laugh in just about equal measure. Nell Stevens has a degree in English and Creative Writing from Warwick and went on to study Arabic and Comparative Literature at Harvard as a Frank Knox Memorial Fellow. She received a Marcia Trimble Fellowship and the Florence Engel Randall Graduate Fiction Award for her MFA in Fiction at Boston University. She has just finished her PhD in Victorian Literature at King's College London. Of Bleaker House, Nell's first book, The New Yorker said it was one of the most original, entertaining and thought-provoking books about the difficulty of writing. The Observer described it as entertaining, perverse and singular, and Lena Dunham simply called Bleaker House perfect. Please join me in welcoming Nell Stevens to Shakespeare and Company. Nell, welcome.
Thank you.
So I guess before we hear a little reading from Bleaker House, maybe you could set us up. Maybe you could give us a bit of context. So how did you find yourself on one of the, I don't know if it's a lesser-known Falkland Islands or one of the Falkland Islands?
I think it might be a more known Falkland
Okay.
Island thanks to this book, unfortunately. They're not very pleased about that. So I spent my 20s looking for ways to write fiction and failing in all sorts of creative and less creative ways, and ended up at Boston University doing my MFA. A slightly eccentric millionaire, possibly billionaire, turned up at BU one day and decided he would set up a fellowship that would send the graduates of the MFA program anywhere in the world that they wanted to go for 3 months once they'd finished their studies. This was a fairly new program when I arrived at BU, and we spent the entire year slightly fixated on where we were going to go. And I ended up thinking about it, I suppose, as where would I go that I would never use my own money to get myself to. So I thought about going somewhere lovely, and then I thought there's a chance that maybe I would pay for myself to go there one day. So I ruled out Rome, and I ruled out Paris, and I ruled out Morocco and various sunny places, and ended up thinking about the Falklands. And once I started looking at the Falklands, there was no way I could resist the name Bleaker Island. It was an inevitability at that point. So that's where I ended up.
And it sounds almost like there was a sort of an urge for kind of self-punishment in that.
Oh, absolutely. I felt, this is a terrible idea, I don't recommend it. I think I felt that I needed to suffer in order to create good work. Many people have laboured under this misapprehension. I thought that I had to be uncomfortable. I had lived a fairly comfortable life and had been trying to find ways to make myself uncomfortable in various situations. And this was the sort of pinnacle of those efforts, was to take myself away somewhere where I knew I would be cold, and I knew I would be lonely, and I knew that I wouldn't have enough to eat. And I thought that those were the conditions that would create good work. I'd read far too much Hemingway.
We'll talk a little bit later about the wisdom of that particular urge, but maybe now would be a good moment to hear an extract from Bleaker House.
So I'm going to read a slightly chopped up version of the prologue, which opens on the island and then flashes back to various moments in my decision-making process. That's how I got there. This is a landscape an art therapy patient might paint to represent depression. Grey sky and a sweep of featureless peat rising out of the sea. The water is the same colour as the clouds. It is flecked by white-capped waves, spikes of black rock, and, intermittently, the silvery spines of dolphins. I pace from room to room in the empty house, testing out the silence with occasional noises. Hi, ha, who, how. My fingers are stiff with cold. When I open my notebook, I fumble with the pages. I struggle to grip the pen. I write the title of a journal entry, Bleaker Island, Day 1. Beneath it, an attempt at a beginning. I am living alone on an island. I spell it out to myself. I try to make sense of where I astonishingly am. What I've written sounds like a metaphor, so I clarify. This is not a metaphor. I am living alone on an island, a real island in the Antarctic waters of the South Atlantic, and the name of the island is Bleaker. In the applications I send out to creative writing MFA programs in the States, 2 years before I find myself on the island, I quote Ted Hughes. For me, successful writing has usually been a case of having found good conditions for real, effortless concentration. I want to do an MFA because I desperately want to concentrate, because it will mean I won't have to work in my draining, unrewarding office job, and because it will take me away from my friends and family in the UK to a place where I will know nobody from whom to demand distraction. But, of course, it doesn't. I'm accepted onto the 1-year intensive fiction MFA at Boston University, where, as in London, life gets in the way. I make new friends, develop crushes, go on dates, and spend more time than I could possibly have imagined on the phone to the Bank of America and Verizon and the BU International Students and Scholars Office. I worry about rent money and my tax return and my hair and my visa and whether the thing I said to my roommate about the way her voice carries came out wrong. At the end of the year, there is a chance at redemption. The program ends in a global fellowship. We are sent out into the world, wherever we choose to go, to spend 3 months living, exploring, writing. In March, there's an information session which outlines the application process and how much money we can expect. I become preoccupied with thoughts and plans and schemes. I don't want to waste my fellowship. I want to do it right. The absorbing vision of effortless concentration appears before me again, and I find myself pining for empty, remote places, snow plains, broad lakes, oceans, wherever there is more nothing than there is something, and where I imagine I will finally do the thing I have spent my adult life hankering after, attempting, and interrupting: write a novel. I wonder how productive, how focused, how effective I can be. On the phone to my mother, I tell her, I want to know how good at life I can be in a place where there are no distractions. After a long Boston winter, it is finally spring, and I'm walking down Commonwealth Avenue in bright sunlight. Around me, the city is busy and shiny and diverting. And where is that exactly? My mother asks. The Falklands, I say. I think it's the Falklands. Even as I make this statement, I want to know how good at life I can be in a place where there are no distractions. I question it. I wonder how naive I'm being. Surely by now I should know that wherever I am, wherever I go, however determined, I can find ways to distract myself, to procrastinate, to put off the real labor of creating something with words. It turns out, though, that I am not being naive. As I stand in the sunshine talking on the phone to my mother, watching cars and buses and students with cups of frozen yogurt go past, I cannot begin to conceive of how few distractions there will be on Bleaker Island. On the island, I set out to explore. The house is on a narrow section in the relative shelter of a hill, which I climb, bent into the wind and small shards of freezing rain. From the top, you can see the whole curve of the land, cliffs on the west side and a beach on the east, speckled with black and white dots that, when you walk towards them, bloom into penguins. They waddle and slither into the waves and run out again like delighted toddlers. Caracaras cluster overhead, eyeing anything that shines. I walk for hours and see only monosyllables: cliffs, birds, waves, sand, sheep, rock, moss. The thing I'm most scared of is getting depressed, I say. This is with friends in London the night before I begin my journey to the South Atlantic. We're drinking wine in a Hackney flat. I've finished my year in Boston and flown back to the UK to attend a wedding and dump 3 suitcases of clothes and books on the floor of my childhood bedroom at my parents' house. It's hot. People are fanning themselves with coasters. My hair is sticking to the sweat on my temples. We take turns squeezing out onto the tiny balcony. Over the rooftops of dimly lit estates, the city shines. It strikes me that even this, the heat, the sweat, the electric horizon, will soon be precious. Everyone seems to have a strong opinion about what I'm about to do. The lawyer, who is stressed and overworked, thinks the isolation will be wonderful, a complete escape. You can do yoga, you can meditate. The ecologist wants to know about the wildlife, wants me to set up a blog. The actor says, it'll be a chance to really get to know yourself. Then, doubtfully, but perhaps you know yourself quite well already. The primary school teacher is the only one who downs her glass, looks me in the eye and says, of course you'll get depressed. It's going to be fucking horrible. It will be cold and you won't have enough to eat. You got depressed house sitting alone in Wales for a week. Thank you.
Thank you. You said in that that extract you read, you said that this is not a metaphor. This is you are actually on an island. But in a way, I guess before you went there, do you feel now, in retrospect, you were chasing a metaphor? Like there was a certain idea rather than a reality that you were setting your sights on?
Absolutely, and I think I was trying to make a metaphor literal in order to be able to face it. I definitely had this idea that writing was inevitably very, very lonely, and that in order to become a writer, I had to be able to conquer that as an idea. And so my approach was to go somewhere where I'd have no choice but to be lonely and deal with that. And somehow, through that process, I would find myself to be the writer I wanted to be.
So, in fact, the loneliness of the activity of writing, in a way, wasn't enough. You had to make it. You had to make it real.
I think because I had spent so much time writing and failing to produce anything of any value whatsoever, the loneliness of writing in a city, as I had been doing, didn't seem enough, and I had attributed my failure to perhaps distraction and lack of focus, which with hindsight perhaps wasn't true. I think it was almost the expectations I was putting on myself at that moment in my life that was the problem. But I definitely took the idea of a lonely writer and wanted to make it literal, just as a way of almost checking that this was something I could do.
So this was, as you said, something that came out of the Boston University,
Right.
out of the generosity of, I don't know if he's an anonymous donor or...
He's not anonymous. He's called Bob Hildreth.
Okay.
But he didn't have the fellowships named after him. So yeah.
Okay, so a modest donor.
You see, if you met him, you wouldn't even say, hi, Bob, wherever he is. But yeah, he wouldn't necessarily seem modest, but eccentric for sure.
And so, and the experience at Boston seemed to be very formative for you as well. I think particularly the one of your professors, Leslie Epstein.
Yeah.
Could you just talk a little bit about the experience of studying at Boston under Leslie Epstein that then led you to make this decision to go to the Falklands?
I think part of what I loved about studying under Leslie Epstein was the same masochistic part of me that thought I should go to an island by myself to write, which was feeling that the way to improve was through a degree of punishment. He was a brutal teacher. It was absolutely routine for students to cry in his class. And I wanted that. I remember going around other programs and watching students being praised, and I thought how little I would learn from praise. And you don't often learn from praise, I think. And it's a lot easier to give praise than to criticize. I know that now from having taught myself, that if you have a really shocking student in your class, it's so much easier to say, oh, it's great, well done, than try and make someone understand where they went wrong. And Leslie is completely incapable of giving praise where it's not earned, and I loved him for it. One of the other students who wasn't taught by him described us all as having Stockholm syndrome for Leslie. We were all just completely devoted to him.
You make me think of the movie Whiplash.
It's my favourite film.
Okay. With this kind of sadistic
I love a
music
hardcore teacher.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
He gets a shout out in the book.
That's true. Yeah. And so, just to put it into context, so how many of you were on the course?
There were 10 of us.
Okay, and where did the other students choose to go?
So because a lot of them were American and had family from all around the world, sort of distant family, a lot of them chose to go back to where their sort of grandparents and great-grandparents had immigrated to America from. Okay. That was quite a common choice. So lots of people went back to East Asia and various parts of Eastern Europe. One person went to Paris and had a lovely time. They say that they've been to every continent, the fellows on this. It's quite a well set out people. And
were you the first to head so far south?
I was. Yes, I think when they say all the continents, they're counting me as being in Antarctica, which is really a bit of a stretch, but I'll take it.
And what was your? Did you have any preconceptions about the Falkland Islands particularly? I mean, obviously you said that you chose it because of the remoteness. But beyond that, I mean, obviously growing up in Britain, there is this sort of history of antagonism over these islands. Did that sort of feed into your decision at all?
Well, part of my decision to go was to do with this idea of whose stories you're allowed to tell. And I was really anxious that I didn't set off for Tanzania and then write a book about Tanzania, because we don't need another white writer writing about Tanzania. So I was looking for somewhere that wasn't the UK that I felt I could comment on. And that leads you quite specifically to this place that was both remote and insistent upon their Britishness. So that was very interesting to me, that they seemed so foreign and so intent on being the same as me. My preconceptions were political, I suppose, that you see pictures of their sort of shrines to Margaret Thatcher, and that's not something I particularly relate to. But apart from that, I think I was very romantic about it. I thought there was something sort of incredibly pure about living somewhere remote, which is a very odd idea. I don't know where I got it from.
Well, we'll come on to the specific oddness of that idea in a bit, but just in the spending in the time before you left. How long before you left did you decide to go there?
So a few months.
A few months, okay. And in those few months, I'd just be interested in the kind of the emotional... Was it an emotional roller coaster? Were there times when you thought, oh my God, what have I done? Or once you'd committed to it, were you certain that it... Not necessarily that it was a good decision, but that you were going to go through with it and that it...
I thought it was the best idea that anyone had ever had for how to spend their fellowship. And I was very convinced that if I told anyone, they would steal it and come too, which would have ruined the whole thing. That rapidly dispersed as an idea. I think once I'd booked everything and realised I was actually going, I felt terrified. I remember having a conversation with some friends and saying, I've done some weird stuff in my life. This is by far the weirdest. It felt like an extremely scary thing to do. I was very scared.
It's for me it was absolutely fascinating to read. I think particularly the sort of your first impressions of when you got onto the island, because it struck me that there were elements which must have been incredibly familiar. This kind of rural Britishness in a way, and yet in a context that was so geographically removed. From Britain.
It's uncanny. So it's very surreal arriving in Port Stanley, which is the capital city, and the landscape is so foreign. It looks, when you take a photograph, it looks like you took it in black and white often, and it's not. It's just that it's grey sky, white snow, grey water, and then you'll see a double-decker red London bus, and it is very jarring. And then you add into that landscape these people who respond culturally to you as you would expect people in a rural English village to respond, yet they have a different accent and they are so suspicious of any outsiders. It's uncanny.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but can you do the accent, or at least give us an idea of what it sounds like?
I had to try for the audiobook and failed miserably. So I'll give a description of it, which is West Country plus Irish plus Australian. So there's a sort of Southern Hemisphere twang on top of a very rural British or Irish accent. And I'm not going to try.
And culturally, I mean, obviously, sort of in the way that we think of people from Gibraltar as well, sort of being culturally British, but there's this kind of, for example, with Gibraltar, this sense of kind of an exaggerated Britishness. Again, was that something that you found?
they're more patriotic than any British person in the British Isles, without a doubt. And they call the UK home. And many of them have not been there or go once or twice in their lifetimes, but they will say like, oh, she's from home, which is a really strange feeling to me.
Is what they said about you. They would say that you were from home.
She's from home, or she's from UK.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a moment where you say the only people islanders trust less than Argentinians are writers.
Absolutely, they can't stand them.
And so did you feel that antagonism when you were first on the island?
Well, I was very cautious about telling anyone why I was there. So for a long time I said I was a teacher of writing, and they were very anxious to set up a workshop where I would teach them writing, and that never happened because apparently you're not allowed to work even if you're not paid as a foreigner in the Falklands. So I sort of dodged a bullet there, I think. But I was very cautious about telling them why I was there, and it was lucky that I thought I was there to write a novel. Because I really did think I was there to write fiction, and I was never going to write about any of them, and that gave me some freedom. I don't think they'd had a novelist before.
Okay.
They were used to having journalists turn up, often Argentinian journalists, which is the worst of both worlds, but not a novelist, so that seemed more distant, and they didn't really know quite what I was doing, and they thought maybe I was a historian because I went to the archives, and it seemed less personal. So now, having left and produced a book that details my conversations with them in every detail, I feel quite awkward about that, and I'm sure if I'd gone knowing that was my intention, I would have had a really different experience.
And since the publication of the book, has there been, did you keep in touch with anybody that you met when you were there, and have you had any feedback?
Not I was vaguely in touch with the people who live on Bleaker Island, because they were just phenomenally gracious and tolerant of this weirdo who turned up and used their home as an experiment. So I wrote to them and told them, that novel I was writing, this is not really a novel anymore, and I've written a book, and it's about my time on the island, and I've tried not to be intrusive. And they were far more interested in telling me about the penguins and how I should come in the summer, and I think they feel so distant from it that it was not as big a deal as I thought it would be in the end.
Because, and I'd like to come on to the novel itself and the writing in a moment, because that's as much a part of the book as your experience on the island itself. But we spoke a little bit about the loneliness, the kind of the emotional hardness, but it wasn't just emotional difficulty. There was a physical edge to it too. So of course you were for the first your first few weeks there, you were in, could we say, can't quite say a town, can we? It doesn't quite.
They would say a city. So
they would say a city.
We'll say a town.
Okay, but then Bleaker itself, you had to go there with all of the food that you were going to consume, or that you planned to consume during your time there. And well, maybe you could, before we talk about it, give us a bit of a rundown of what you were able to take and why you were only able to take a certain amount. I'm sure it is.
Very unvaried diet. So the logic was that I had to bring things that are high in calories and low in weight, because the planes are tiny and you have to pay for your luggage, including your own body weight, which is mortifying. So I took a lot of powdered soup. I took sort of porridge that you add water and put in the microwave, almonds, raisins, granola bars, fibre gel, and Ferrero Rocher. So.
Which sounds like an indulgence, but in fact isn't so much.
Essential.
But also because it's very light and very calorific.
Oh, it was high in calories and very light. Also, possibly the one thing that kept me sane, because it turns out you do have to do things that are nice for yourself. And that was my daily joy, was eating a single Ferrero Rocher as slowly as I could. But
even with that, even when it's sort of so rigorously planned, you only allowed, now I wrote this down, it was 1,085 calories a day, which is approximately half of the recommended maximum.
It was not enough. Yes, which was not necessary. If I had known and been sort of plugged into networks of how you do these things. The way you feed yourself on an island in the Falklands is you put an order in months in advance to the ships that come round, and I would have had a delivery stop by, but as a sort of slightly scatterbrained 27-year-old, that was not how I went about these things. And I had the potato.
Oh yes, which we will certainly come on to in a moment. And so but in fact, if you'd have done all of that planning, then you wouldn't have experienced the hardship that you were so clearly seeking in order to produce the novel.
And it sounds so ridiculous that being undernourished would produce a novel, but...
So let's talk about that novel. So you have done everything to set up what you considered the perfect conditions for the novel. So you were isolated. It was a harsh environment. It was, you were suffering because you were hungry. You were lonely. So it was perfect. I mean, the writing conditions were great, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's definitely how you should go about it. I mean, I always feel oddly still a little bit defensive. I know how ridiculous it sounds, but I also feel insistent upon the fact that I did write a lot while I was there. And I was living this incredibly regimented life where it was, powdered soup at noon and a raisin at 1, and, it was tragic. But part of that regime was writing 2,500 words a day, and I did it every day. The problem was they were not good, but I did produce the work. So in a sense it paid off, and I look back on it now as the thing that I thought I was doing in order to write this book, and I don't see it as a complete waste.
Of course. And the 2,500 words a day was, of course, to produce the sort of the necessary 80,000 words, which is considered the appropriate length for a debut novel.
I think I budgeted for a week for editing, which is definitely enough. Yeah.
And of course, you went out there not only with this intention of writing this 80,000 word debut novel, but also with, I think, sort of certain conflicting ideas of what creativity was.
Yeah.
And I noted there were essentially three. Like, there was Philip Pullman, there was Wordsworth, and there was Ted Hughes.
Yeah.
Would you just be able to kind of tell us the three contrasting?
So anyone who's wanted to be a writer will have spent far too much time reading writers' tips for how to be a writer. And there are essentially two schools that I kept wondering where I fell into between these two things of either you write when you're inspired, which is sort of Wordsworth approach of you wait for a brilliant idea and then you write it all down and that's done, or there's a sort of slightly more jobbing writer professional approach where you write day in day out whether or not you have a good idea, and that's what Philip Pullman was advocating. And I mean, I think it's entirely pointless for writers to say these things, because if it's not the way you work, then it's never going to work. But I suppose my island sojourn was an attempt at a Philip Pullman, which didn't turn out that great.
But it was there as the
this idea
ambition.
That, so if you only, I think the quote is something like, if you only write when you feel like it, you'll always be an amateur.
Now, among one of the things that you took with you was the Charles Dickens novel, Bleaker House.
Yes.
And in fact, I think that was the only physical.
Yes, I had Reality Hunger, and which I read and put away, and then Bleaker House, which I obsessed over. And
I mean, there's something rather beautiful and poetic and sort of synchronicitous about obviously the title of your book and the Dickens novel that you chose to take with you. Did you choose to take that purely based on the name of the island you were going to? You just liked the kind of the rhyme of it?
Well, that was the reason I took that particular Dickens, but I love Victorian fiction. I did a master's in it and adore it, and when I think about how to write a novel, I think of those novels. I think of Dickens and George Eliot and Elizabeth Gaskell. So I did think if I could spend enough time with one of them and unpick it enough, I would find out how it was done.
But then when you chose the Dickens, it was because of the...
And then that Dickens, because I had this idea that I could write a very self-aware meta novel called Bleaker House.
But there's this strange thing that happens because you're sort of limited to this one, at least this one sort of one or two physical books, is that there seems to be this kind of interplay which develops between the themes and the characters and the story of the novel and what's going on in your experience on the island?
It was fascinating to sort of observe myself doing this, which was, I think, I want to say I could have been any book. That's possibly not true, but if you spend enough time with anything demanding meaning from it, it becomes meaningful. So I began to apply these ideas about... Bleaker House became, for me, a book about a lot of people doing pointless writing. And there is a lot of scrap paper in Bleaker House. It's a book where a lot of people are learning to write or failing to write or losing bits of paper. And that became incredibly important to me and sort of shifted my interests almost away from my novel to my failure to write a novel.
And I'm fascinated by this idea. Do you think that could have happened with almost any book?
I'm still trying to work it out. I think the way I describe it in the book is that it was almost like becoming someone who believed in a horoscope, that you can find meaning where you're looking for it. So in that sense, it maybe could have been any novel. I wonder, probably not a bad novel. I think if you have a great novel, that's what they do, is they produce meanings for you in different ways, no matter how you look at it. But I'm still not quite sure, like, if it had been 50 Shades of Grey, whether I would have had a really profound emotional experience with that book.
Well, of course, the other piece of media you had with you, of course, you only had, at least to begin with, one film on your laptop, which I mean, I don't know if you even want us to mention it.
Oh, we can go there. People don't believe this. They think it was a sort of heavy-handed attempt to reference this particular film, but I really did have Eat, Pray, Love on my laptop. Unintentionally. I didn't... This sounds very naive, and I was very naive. I didn't understand that there could be such bad internet that you couldn't download or stream films. I couldn't comprehend it. So that wasn't part of my planning in any way. And when I got there and realized that when they say they have Wi-Fi, they don't mean it in any recognizable form. That was what I was stuck with. What I happened to have was Eat, Pray, Love. And it's probably not what we want to do, but I could quote you the entire film.
Well, I think, time is getting on and everything. But it's interesting that you would have this kind of this great work of literature and this, let's just call it a popcorn film and maybe leave it at that. But did you feel, does that now occupy a sort of a special place in your heart and in your head as a result of only having access to this?
Not in the same way that Bleaker House does, because it was the thing I did to not think. That it was sort of part of the Ferrero Rocher routine, that I'd done my reading, I'd done my writing, I could have the first third of Eat, Pray, Love and a Ferrero Rocher at the end of the day. It did make me think a lot about how we talk about women's journeys, though, and there's this particular genre that Bleaker House almost sets a toe into and then withdraws from, of a particular kind of self-discovery narrative that women often end up playing into or writing or being put into, that I don't think is particularly common for men to do. So in that sense, it gave me food for thought.
And how many times have you seen it then, this film?
I could probably calculate, but I used to watch a third a day. So she goes to 3 countries, so I used to watch a country a day. And sometimes if I was really going to draw it out, I would watch the New York bit at the beginning as a separate section, and then to Rome. But so then you can get 4 out of it.
I like the way you become very serious when you talk about this.
It's a serious... Staying sane on an island is a very serious business.
Let's talk about the book itself, the book that you were writing when you were there. Now,
yes.
I guess it's probably not an enormous spoiler to say that the novel didn't turn out quite how you were expecting it. And yet, one of the fascinating things about Bleaker House, the book that did result from it, is that it's not entirely memoir. In fact, it's memoir interwoven with fiction.
I always end up calling it a sort of memoir, but yours is much more eloquent. So.
Thank you. But I'm fascinated then, in that case, by the epigraph. I don't know if we call it an epigraph when somebody writes it themselves. But anyway, what do you write on the very first page of the book?
Oh, I'm really excited to talk about this.
Okay, well,
so this was added
you can read it for
because we had to have a legal read. So it was a libel lawyer's intervention that created this. So the first page of the book that's written by me and a libel lawyer is, "This is a work of memory and invention by someone who set out to be a novelist. The memoir chapters include fictionalized characters, events, and chronologies, and the interspersed fiction is just that."
And before the just that, to allow our audience to visualize it, there is a very heavy ellipses.
Yes.
So the fiction parts are ... Just that.
Yes.
I must admit, when I first read that, I did think, I'm wondering if the writer here protests too much. But now you've told me that it was a lawyer that helped you write it. Maybe we shouldn't delve too deeply into what is truth and what is fiction. But
well, my preferred disclaimer was just to write some of this is true, but apparently that was a sort of invitation to be sued, so we weren't allowed to do that. I think it was a lot of what I was thinking about when I was writing this book was the space between writing non-fiction and fiction, and the distinctions we make, which the French, as I'm sure most of you know, have almost no problem with, and yet in the UK and America we really don't know how to inhabit that space very comfortably. So a lot of what I was trying to do in the book is set side by side moments of non-fiction about my life with the fiction that came out of them, and juxtapose those things and see the different choices you make when you write in those different genres. So I heard Christoph Boltanski speak, and his new novel, which I think is going to be translated as The Safe House, I'm not sure if it's out yet, which is published as a novel in France and will be published as a memoir in the States, said any truth longer than 4 lines is a fiction. I think he might have been quoting someone else, but it's a very useful way of thinking to me, which is we're completely addicted to this idea that all memoir is true, and yet the minute you try and shape something on the page, you're making choices and you're omitting things, and then add on top of that imposing a structure on a story about your own life where there is none, and then additionally a libel read from a very officious lawyer. You've created something that is nothing like what you experienced and is as creative and therefore as untrue as a piece of fiction. So I was really interested in getting into that space and understanding what that was.
And that is definitely something that you play with, and I think very effectively in the book, is this sort of so there's the sections that let's say are ostensibly presented as memoir, and then the stories. So there's these kind of elements which are ostensibly presented as fiction, whether they're extracts of the novel that you are writing or short stories which you have written before or after your time on the island. And yet, from what you've told us about your life, it's clearly to a certain extent inspired by real events. It sounds quite complex when I describe it like that, and yet it flows very naturally in the book. Was it quite a difficult sort of conclusion to settle on, that sort of that distinction, or did it come quite naturally in the writing?
I definitely always conceived of it as a book in which I would, in fact, more so than a book about going to an island, I thought of it as a book where I would place fiction alongside stories of where and how I came to write those pieces of fiction, and that was my primary interest. In terms of organising it, it was extremely difficult, and I'm not sure there is a right answer to how you organise Bleaker House. I don't think we could ever have got it right. But that was I suppose the question I had in my mind when I started writing it was, how do you think about your life when you're constantly mining it for fiction? And that's to me what holds this book together.
And that is actually the final thing I think I'd like to talk about before we open up for audience questions, is this idea. Now, this thing that comes up constantly in the book is this idea of experiencing life in order to write about it. Now, there's a friend of yours from, I think, from Boston, if I remember rightly, who says, every bad experience is good material for a writer. And that seems to me as sort of a very, let's say, particular approach to fiction. That's just sort of, and not only is it a case of sort of mining the bad experiences you've had, but there are also moments where, with Bleaker Island, but also other moments in your life where you specifically set out in order to have bad experiences so you can write about them.
and sort of call it research, which is a generous term for what that is when you're using other people's experiences of you as research. I find it fascinating, especially when you're surrounded by other writers, as I was at BU when there was a group of 10 of us. And by the end of the year, the stories were all just about each other. And it became incredibly tense in the workshop. And you'd kind of be looking, like, oh, that sounds like Chris. And then you'd find things out about each other's personal lives through their fiction, which you're not it's very unfashionable to think that way, that we could learn something about someone's actual life from the way they write. And yet it's impossible not to draw those conclusions. And it's impossible not to use your own experiences in your life. So I still don't know the answer, but that was definitely the question. Was like, what does it mean to organize your life in that way, and how does it affect your relationships with other people, especially with other writers, when you're both writing about each other, as happens towards the end of the book? How to use those experiences in an authentic way rather than a somewhat manipulative or contrived way, I suppose.
And I guess in a way that's probably was quite good that after that sort of intense experience you were all sent off to different corners of the world.
It was necessary. Yeah. I now wonder whether the purpose of that fellowship was really to stop any murders from taking place.
To break up the group before things go too far. And was there a feeling in writing Bleaker House as sort of because I think there's a lot in there that is very useful for people who are setting out on the sort of the writing journey to sort of you sort of signal certain pitfalls. Now, of course, the pitfalls are probably going to be different for each individual writer. But was there a feeling in writing this book that it's not so as much a sort of memoir, but also sort of I wouldn't quite go as far as to say a guide, but sort of I've made the mistake so you don't have to kind of thing. Was there this idea that people might be able to read this and this would help them in their writing endeavours?
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. I think of myself as such a terrible role model for people who want to write novels. But also, not that I do think every bad experience you have is good material. I don't completely subscribe to that, but I do think you have to make all your own mistakes as a writer in order. I had to go to the island and write a terrible novel in order to write a hopefully less terrible memoir. I am a really passionate advocate of being taught. It's not necessarily fashionable, and people have lots of strong feelings about MFA programs, but to me, learning to write should be like learning to play the piano. Just because we all know how to do it in a basic sense doesn't mean that we should assume we can do it at virtuoso level. And I got so much out of studying with someone I consider to be a master, and there's a lot in the book of what I learned from Leslie that I was very anxious to share, because it completely transformed the way I thought about my work. So in that sense, there are some perhaps guidelines or suggestions in what I've included from my lessons that I learned.
Okay, thank you. Now, it's over to you. Does anybody have a question they would like to ask Nell? Don't be shy. Put up your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. This lady here.
Hi. I wanted to know, so you went to the island and you wrote not a novel like you expected, but this memoir. How do you decide like what's bad and what's good? Like before you said that all you wrote before was bad. And so how did you decide that this was good enough to be published?
Do you know, this is something I've only just started to admit, but I didn't realise until Bleaker House was published how bad the novel was, until people started saying, oh, it's hilarious how bad the novel is. I knew that it wasn't working because I couldn't finish it. There comes a point when there's nothing more to say, and then you realise that this was not an honest project. But I knew that Bleaker House was better because people decided that they were willing to publish it. I'm a terrible judge of my own work. I think part of what I learned in a workshop situation was to become better at it. That you learn sort of through that feedback, oh, people hate it when I do this thing, or Leslie makes me cry when I do this thing. And you learn through that, but it's still very, very difficult. Other than that, you feel good when you do good work, not always, but sometimes. And I didn't feel good writing the novel, and people tell you, which is a bit depressing.
I'm just interested, you used the word honest.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, could you just develop on that idea a little bit?
I suppose I'm still working these ideas out. I think it sounds a little bit flighty, but I think you do have to have what I would call honest intentions to make good work. And my intentions with writing the novel that I was trying to write were to sort of save my own life. I wanted to end my 20s not as a administrator or a barista or an assistant to someone who I hated, but as someone who could say I'm a writer. So I was putting all of that into this novel, and that's not how you make a novel. That's a dishonest intention. I suppose that's what I mean by that.
Okay. Any more questions? Don't be shy. Yeah, just over there.
Hi. I'm curious, as you ended up not writing a novel, what your next steps are, or how you feel your relationship with coming up with a plot, coming up with characters is in the future. Were you disappointed, or were you pleased that you ended up finding a format that really worked for you? How do you feel your relationship with coming up with plot and characters has changed?
I'm working on it. So my next book is not a novel, disappointingly. It's another sort of memoir. I'm trying to understand why I privilege the novel as a superior art form, and I definitely do. And I'm not entirely sure why I think that way, that it's somehow a higher calling than writing memoir, but I still feel that I want to write a novel. And in some ways, I feel less confident than ever about how to do that. It's definitely going to be book 3. I don't know how long it will take. One thing I am intrigued by and grateful for is, like, especially in American writing, a sort of burgeoning autofiction scene. So I'm thinking about Ben Lerner and Jenny Offill, and Elif Batuman has written, her new novel is somewhat in that mode, of writing very close to life and deviating in certain aspects and having fun with that, which is sort of what Bleaker House is doing from the other side of the divide. So I find that very interesting and sort of reassuring that my transition into fiction could maybe ride on that sort of writing where I continue to tell my own stories and deviate from them, but with fiction on the back instead of non-fiction.
Thank you. Any more? Yeah, just gentleman over there.
Thank you. Hello. Just one question. Before you chose the Falklands, were you aware of the place where George Orwell wrote 1984? It's a place called Barnhill Cottage. It's at the very end of an island off the coast of Scotland called Jura. It's a completely remote place. I walked there because I thought I might get something from how people actually make it to write something interesting. And the first title of 1984 was The Last Man in Europe. And but were you aware of that before you? Because I think it's quite known that he went somewhere remote away from London to write that thing. Did you know that?
I wasn't aware of that specific island. I did think of. I was told by many people that the Scottish sort of islands would be just as good and somewhat easier, but that was in itself unappealing. I think I had to go somewhere that was difficult to get to and therefore difficult to get away from. That was all part of this idea of putting myself away, and away meant Scotland feels, even remote parts of Scotland to me feel disappointingly accessible. More so than in Orwell's time, but that's the idea, right? That you would go to an island and write a great work, and some people do, case in point. But I wanted to be as far away as I could get. I wanted to be unreachable. That somehow was part of the test that I was putting myself through.
Any more? Well, I've got 2 more things I wanted to ask you. The first one, we mentioned the potato earlier, and I said we'd come back to it, and we didn't.
Come back to the potato.
The potato, it might sound strange to hear, is, I'd say, kind of one of the principal characters of Bleaker House. So avoiding any spoilers, could you just set up this character of the potato for us?
I was slightly secretive about my food situation to actual Falkland Islanders. I was quite embarrassed by how badly prepared I was, and very aware that they, miraculously to me, managed to live a fairly ordinary existence in these quite extreme conditions. I think this lady, who in the book is called Alison, on the island, I think clocked that I was somewhat malnourished. And before she took off to go to Stanley, she arrived at my front door with a potato and presented it to me as, a gift. And this was the most nutritious and hearty and important item that I had with me, and became, I suppose, a character. That it was this item that symbolized success, because I thought I'll eat the potato success or failure, I suppose. Either when I've written my novel and I can celebrate and I can eat the potato, or when I'm feeling so low and so miserable that I need the potato. And I would go and visit the potato and look at the potato and wonder when the potato time would be. And if I was having a bad day, I would think, is it the potato day?
And I think we should leave it unsaid if and when or how the potato gets eaten or doesn't get eaten. We'll see. That's in the book. You'll have to buy it and read it to find out. My final question then was, you talked quite evocatively about Leslie, your teacher at Boston. Has he read the book, and how did he react to it?
He has read the book. Of all the people who were going to read the book, I was most terrified of Leslie reading the book, because he could read a paragraph of anyone's writing and tear you to shreds in a second. So not only was this just a lot of my writing that he was about to read, it was a lot of my writing about him. So I was terrified, and I put it off for a long time. And I should say first, he is the most gracious human being you could meet. And I wrote this very apologetic email to him saying, I've written this book, it's sort of about you. I'm going to send you it, and you can just take out anything that you want. Don't worry. And he said, at that point, you can send it if you want. I don't feel the need to read it. A writer should be able to say whatever she wants, which is an incredibly gracious response to having been told that someone's written a book about you. So that was his first response. And then when I sent it to him, he was just extremely generous. He sent me a list of typos and some moments where I had deviated from his rules, of which there are many, and they are not to be broken. And then I think he was quite moved. I think he is someone who has dedicated his life to teaching, and I'm going to say he's approaching 80 now. So I think he was quite pleased to have a testament to what he has done in this workshop, which is an incredible achievement. He came to a reading that I did in Boston, and I just read a scene about him to him, and he didn't combust. So I feel that was a success.
Which I think is probably more of a kind of weighty recommendation than I could give for the book, but I'm going to give it anyway. Do read Bleaker House. It's not only great fun, it's very insightful. It's a fascinating look at the writing process, and the writing process under pressure, even if that is self-imposed pressure. It's funny, it's heartfelt, it's great. We have plenty of copies at the till. I'm sure Nell will be delighted to sign them for you. Please do stick around. We're going to be having a glass of wine. But one more time, please do give it up for Nell Stevens. Thank you very much.
Thank you.